Mr. Allman here. I'd like to tell you today about the ear. In this Allmancast, I'm going to deliver to you the message that your mother wants you to hear. So we'll go through both the physical parts so that you will be able to know how to draw and label the different parts of the outer, middle, and inner ear. And also we need to go through what the functions of the different parts of the ear are for to help you accomplish both of those tasks. If we start with what the ear is responsible for, the auditory system, which is responsible for hearing, and the vestibular system, which is going to provide you with your sense of balance. Now, both of those have mechanoreceptors. A mechanoreceptor is a type of nerve cell that is going to respond to a mechanical stimulus. So if it moves, it's going to be able to send a signal through the nerve to the brain. The particular part within it is called stereocilia. And this is an important term that will come up several times. It's really a type of microvilli, these kind of small hair-like projections that are going to move in response to a stimulus. We divide the ear into three parts. There is the outer ear, the middle ear, which is here in orange, and then the inner ear, pictured here in green. The outer ear is made up of the pinna, as well as the auditory canal. Then the middle ear starts with the tympanic membrane, continues through the ossicles, which are the bones of the middle ear, and ends with the round window. The inner ear, the two main parts of the semicircular canals, which appear here on top, and the cochlea, which is going to be the spiral part that's connected to the auditory nerve. I will take a brief moment to dive into some physics, and the question is, what is sound? Now, sound are the vibrations that travel through the air. They could also travel through other mediums. They travel through water, through rock, but mostly what we deal with here on land are these waves, pressure waves that travel through the air. Now, our auditory system is capable of recognizing only a certain range of sounds, roughly from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Now, that ability to get those higher frequencies is going to deteriorate as you get older. So as you age, and especially as you get into your 60s, 70s, and 80s, you're not going to be able to hear as wide a range of sound as you do at your age, as teenagers. Now, that sense of sound perception is not the same between different species. So you can see humans, which appear here in pink, and the range of sound that we were able to perceive. As you look at other animals, some of them have much smaller ranges, so you see here some of the, for example, types of birds in gray. But a lot of other mammals actually have a much wider range. If you look at the ferret here, this is one of the stars, from very low frequencies up to very, very high frequencies. Now, that idea of a dog whistle does hold true. You can see that the high-end frequencies of the dogs are much higher than that of the human, and so there actually are certain types of sounds that many animals can hear that is above or at a higher pitch than what we are actually capable of. Now, as the sound travels through the air, it's going to hit our body. So what happens? So first of all, it starts with the pinna. So that thing that we call the ear, that outer flap of cartilage and skin, called the pinna, that is shaped just to allow sound waves to bounce off of the ear and to be directed into the ear canal. The waves are going to travel down the length of the canal, and they're going to end with your eardrum. The eardrum is also known as the tympanic membrane. And so as the sound wave hits the tympanic membrane, that membrane is very thin, and it's going to vibrate. So that's going to be important in setting off the next set of vibrations that are going to be in the middle ear. Within the middle ear, you have a set of three bones. Those bones collectively are called ossicles, or the ear ossicles. The three bones are called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Those are the three smallest bones that appear in your body. They're very, very tiny, very delicate. Now, what happens is that as the vibration of the tympanic membrane gets passed on to each of the bones, the vibration is going to be increased in pressure. So it's really magnifying the impact that the initial sound is having, so that you're going to be able to better perceive what the sound actually is. Now the stapes is going to be attached to another membrane called the oval window. So if you look in the diagram, you can see tympanic membrane here on the left. You can see the malleus is the first bone, the incus the second bone, very small, and then the stapes. The stapes is attached in two spots here to the oval window. So the oval window again is a second membrane, and that membrane is attached to the cochlea, and that's going to be then part of the inner ear. As we move on to the inner ear, you can look first here from a distance. We can see that the cochlea is the main part of the inner ear responsible for your perception of sound. The other parts of the inner ear I'll get to in a moment. Those are going to have to do more with balance. So parts of the cochlea, you have the vestibular canal, which is the first part to which the oval window is attached. You have the cochlear canal, and then the tympanic canal. The inner ear, first of all, unlike the middle ear which was filled with just air, the inner ear is going to be filled with lymph. And so there's a few kinds of lymph, and those are all fluids. So this fluid-filled chamber has a membrane on the bottom of it, and then it has this organ of Corti, which is lined with these hair cells that have those stereocilia sticking out of them. And then that organ of Corti is going to be connected to your auditory nerve. So you can see here the stereocilia sticking out, the hair cell, and then you have the membrane, the basal membrane there along the bottom. At the tip of the stereocilia, there are ion channels. Those ion channels are going to be important in terms of how it is that sound is perceived. You can see here this is a microscopic image that's also been colored of those stereocilia. So you can see how you have this cluster of stereocilia all sticking up, kind of bunched together. So if we go through some of those steps, what's happening? So first of all, so the stapes, which is the ear ossicle, as it vibrates, it causes the oval window membrane to vibrate, which creates a pressure wave. That pressure wave in the fluid is going to cause displacement of the fluid. So the fluid is actually going to physically push through the length of the cochlea. So as the fluid pushes, it pushes against the round window, which is at the end of the cochlea. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so we can take a look at the diagram, and I can talk through those different parts. So you have, again, here you have the stapes, which is causing those vibrations. The fluid is pushed through. As the fluid is pushed through, it goes all the way to the end, and there's a second membrane at the very end of the cochlea, at the end of the spiral. And that is going to vibrate as well. And the vibration there is going to cause a displacement or movement of the membrane which is, you can imagine as this red-colored line. That membrane is going to move, and as that membrane moves, that's going to cause those stereocilia now to be able to vibrate. So, as you can see, if you have this part on the bottom, if you have that membrane vibrating, and you have this part in blue remains stationary, if the bottom vibrates, those stereocilia which connect the bottom to the top, those are going to physically move. So they're going to be, instead of sticking straight up, they're actually going to tilt over from one side to the other. As they tilt, once they tilt over, those ion channels are going to open up, and that's going to cause a depolarization within. So the depolarization is going to trigger the release of neurotransmitters, and the hair cells are going to be connected to neurons, which are going to be connected ultimately to the auditory nerve that's going to send that to the auditory cortex within the cerebrum. So again, you have these vibrations, the vibrations in the fluid, which cause the membrane to move up and down. The membrane moving causes the stereocilia to bend, and that bending is what triggers the neurotransmitters and ultimately the nerve impulse and that action potential to the brain. Now, how is it that the ear is able to perceive different kinds of sound? So there's really two important categories that we can key in on. One is pitch. And so with pitch, we hear our hearing depends on which part of the membrane vibrates. So that fluid travels through the cochlea, but depending on the pitch of the sound wave, those that are very low pitches, that's going to cause displacement of fluid and a vibration of the membrane at the end of the cochlea. You can imagine that it's traveling through the spiral all the way to the center. And so when those stereocilia are going to be bent, our brain perceives that as low frequencies. Higher frequencies are going to stimulate the hair cells at the beginning of the cochlea. So when those cilia bend, we perceive that as high pitches, and obviously there's a range from low to high as it travels a different distance through the cochlea. Now, volume is going to be perceived based on the amplitude of the sound waves. So when it's a louder noise, that's going to exert more pressure, and that additional pressure causes more of the membrane to vibrate, and that's going to stimulate more stereocilia. And so the more cilia bend, then the louder the sound is going to be perceived by our brain. So we'll move on to balance now. So here's a different part of the ear, still within the inner ear, so still that fluid-filled part. Now there's two types of equilibrium that need to be kept. And the reason we have these parts of the inner ear is because your brain always needs to know how the body is oriented, because your sense of balance depends on a lot of very fine muscle movements to make sure that you are moving the right muscle at the right time. So the purpose of the inner ear is to be able to ensure that in 3 dimensions your brain knows exactly where the body is relative to the ground, relative to gravity, so that you can respond with appropriate movements to ensure that your movements are not clumsy, that you're not falling over, that you're being able to maintain control over where the body is. So you have 3 semicircular canals. Those semicircular canals are all oriented on a different plane. So each of those, there's going to be a movement of fluid that's different. So rotational or angular movement. So if you are, for example, you are tipping over, or if you're spinning around in a circle, that's going to move fluid through one or more of those semicircular canals. And so as the fluid moves through, you have sets of these sense organs called cupulas. Now, as the fluid, the fluid is moving to the right, based on what the head is doing, that's going to cause the cupula to bend. And as it bends, those stereocilia are going to be also bent, and that's going to stimulate the nerve in the same way that the cochlea stereocilia were stimulated. So that bending is going to provide information to the brain about how the body is changing position, and so the brain can respond through an appropriate motor output. So you adjust your body position so that you don't fall over. Now the other type of movement, so you can see here in relationship to other things. So these are the semicircular canals. So you see that there's 2 pictured here. There's a third that's not pictured, and so those are the parts that are that have the cupulas that I was just describing. At the base of the semicircular canals and at the base of the cochlea, there is the vestibule, and the vestibule is where you're going to be able to maintain your other sense of balance, and that's going to be gravitational equilibrium. So when you're, for example, moving forward versus standing still, how is it that your brain is able to perceive whether you are in motion? So in this case, it takes place in these 2 parts called the utricle and the saccule. And these are these sacs located in the vestibule at the base of the semicircular canals. And they contain a gelatinous membrane with stereocilia in it and granules of calcium carbonate. So it has these, essentially a kind of salt. It's got these little tiny rocks, and those are resting on top of the membrane. So what's happening is that those are resting. You've got this goo that has the stereocilia sticking out of the top of it. At the base of the stereocilia, again, are those hair cells that are able to perceive if the stereocilia will bend. So how do we perceive motion? So if the head if the head moves in a straight line, then those granules are going to be displaced, so they're going to move. And that's going to cause the membrane to sag, and all the stereocilia are going to bend. When you're upside, so in that case, then your brain recognizes, I'm moving forward. Now, once you're in motion, if you're in constant motion, then the cilia will all straighten back up, and you kind of lose that sense. So it's kind of like if you're sitting in the car and you feel it when the car starts moving, but once the car is at a constant speed, everything resets and you lose that sense that you're really in motion. Now, if you're upside down, in this case, you lose that sense of orientation because there's no nerve impulses on the opposite end. So if you can only really sense if you're moving forwards or backwards, there isn't going to be any impulse if you're upside down. So you have a lot less sense of balance when you're in that orientation. All right, so to get back to why it is that your mother wants you to hear this. So if we go back to what I started with, those earbuds are concentrating a large amount of sound directly into your ear canal. And because your ear consists of mechanoreceptors, so things that are physically moving, if they are physically broken, that's going to have a permanent impact. So let's go through, though, a couple types of hearing loss. The first is conduction deafness. So conduction deafness is going to be a few causes here. One could be a blockage of the ear canal. So for example, if you have a wax that builds up so that it physically blocks the tympanic membrane so that sound doesn't actually enter the middle ear. You can cause physical damage like rupturing of the tympanic membrane. So sometimes if there is an explosion or if you stick a pencil in your ear, that's going to physically rupture that membrane. Usually there'll be a little bit of bleeding, and that is something that is repairable. It can be stitched up or it can heal on its own. And then there's also a stiffening of the bones, and this is what happens most in people in old age. So those bones get stiff, and because they get stiff, they no longer vibrate as much. And if the bones vibrate less, then it's not passing on those vibrations appropriately to the cochlea, and the cochlea never really responds to the sound. There are a lot of tests that you can do using internet programs that will be able to determine the age of your ears based on how high of a frequency you're actually able to perceive. And if you gave an 80-year-old man that test, you would find that you are able to hear a much higher frequency than he is. A real-life example of that are my kids' voices. When my son was 2 years old, he visited his maternal grandfather, who is in his mid-80s, and he has a hearing aid, and he actually, because of this kind of conduction deafness, was not able to hear his voice because as a little boy, the pitch of his voice was too high, the frequency was too high for him to be able to perceive. The most common way to treat conduction deafness is through a hearing aid. So a hearing aid is going to amplify the sound that enters the ear. Second type of hearing loss is called sensorineural hearing loss. And this is when there's a problem in the middle or the inner ear. So there's a wide variety of reasons. So it could be a birth defect, something that is genetic. This also can occur due to prolonged damage. Those hair cells, which you can see listed here, those hair cells are supposed to bend in response to those pressure waves and then return back to the original position. But prolonged contact to really loud noises. So for example, a worker who is exposed to the roar of machines in a factory over long periods of time, or things like prolonged exposure to music that's too loud in earbuds, that's going to physically damage those stereocilia. And that damage is permanent. There's no reversing the hearing loss due to the damage of those cilia within the inner ear. And so the numbers of young people, teenagers, people in their 20s and 30s, that are showing signs of hearing loss is growing rapidly. And as those people age, we know that the problem is only going to get worse. With that, if you have any questions, obviously please ask, and do take care of your ear.